So the main attraction for today's lunch, filling the pool. And in the room today we've got a broad cross-section of our membership, but also a broad cross-section of Perth. So I thought I would take a minute just to position the Committee for Perth in this issue of gender diversity. So our purpose is to promote and enable change that improves the cultural diversity, economic prosperity, sustainability and world-class amenity of metropolitan Perth. So filling the pool is very much about promoting and enabling change. Our vision, amongst many things, is for the region to act in a coordinated and strategic way. Really that means all of us pulling in the same direction. And one of the key planks is the promotion of the high value of our people, and that's where filling the pool fits in. Our mission is to provide a systemic channel through which business and community leaders across Perth can make an enduring contribution to our vision, and so that's where the recommendations lie with you. We've got a triple-pronged research approach. So we undertake academic research, and you would have seen many of the reports we've put out in conjunction with the University of Western Australia. We've also worked in the past with Curtin University, and on this occasion we're working with academics from the Business School at Queensland University. We also speak to people. There's no point in thinking about the future of Perth without having a conversation about it with all of you. So as I said, there was 173 people interviewed as part of this process, and also 350 people participated in focus groups around the draft recommendations. One of the very cool parts of my job is I get to look at cities on the ground and think about what I can bring back to Perth. And in terms of filling the pool, what we did was fed the recommendations into the Women and Power course at Harvard. And what I learned out of that exercise of dealing with women who were in the developed and developing world in very senior roles is you can't have a conversation about gender without having a conversation about race. And sometimes our issues are a little bit 21st century when other women are actually just rescuing women and seeking basic human rights. But there was nothing in the recommendations that was concerning to an international cohort, and probably the most inflammatory discussion we had, where we were really hot under the collar, was about quotas, and Terry will talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. So, what was the starting point for filling the pool? Committee for Perth was established in 2006, and we grew very quickly our membership base over the period to 2010. But there wasn't a diversity in the point of views around our discussion tables, be that the board or be it at our working group level. So in 2011 we started scoping up a project that was to look at how could we get more women into leadership positions. And really this is because the AICD is on record as saying that women on board positions come from the CEO pool, and the CEO pool is drawn upon from the senior executive pool. So if we weren't going to get women up through the hierarchy, we were not going to be making a difference. And at the end of 2011, after much scoping and reshaping, I convened a meeting of senior business women in Perth, and Margaret Sears chaired that meeting for me. There were three things we talked about and resolved. That gender equity was a very complex issue. It was also highly emotive, and we were really sick of having the conversation with ourselves. So we went back to the drawing board almost. So what does the statistics tell us? We're an evidence-based organisation, so we thought this is the starting point. So females are more than half of the graduates from university, and 46% of them are in the full-time workforce. So it's not a pipeline issue. We've got good women, we've got talented women. When you look at that graduate cohort, 55% of females and 45% of males, and you'll just see the inverse lines there, that women, very few, go from that graduate level with all of their aspirations and hopes and dreams for a career that then transcend into those jobs at the top, and obviously the males are a greater proportion of success. In WA, the figures are even worse, and that's one of the things that I think is at the heart of filling the pool. How do we take this conversation forward? So in the report, and you will get a copy on the way out, and you can read all 143 pages in detail, basically it says that it's going to take us 300 years to get to gender parity in terms of CEOs' roles. So something has to change around here. So let's look at the pay gap. That's a good statistic. So 2004, the Australian average was 14.9%, and a decade on it's actually got worse to 18.2%. And then when we look at that in terms of WA and how it fares, it's the worst in the country with 25.3%. And we also uncovered that graduates can often be paid less if they're a female than their male counterparts, and they're coming out of university with the same qualifications and the same lack of experience. So it starts at graduate level and often perpetuates throughout a woman's career. So here's the roadmap that got us from the beginning to the end and to publish the report. And I'm going to take you through a few of these opening slides, and then I'm going to hand over to Terry. So all of this refining of our scope of work resulted in we wanted to investigate what could be done to increase the participation and rates of progression, and I think that's very important, those rates of progression, in order to fill the pool of female talent in order to redress the gender imbalance we have. And that's where Terry comes in. I had read some research from Terry where he had looked at the success factors of ASX 200 CEOs, and he found a gender difference. And that to me was a really good starting point. It was going to be a new way into the conversation. If women lead differently, then, you know, that's interesting. But I think the very critical factor was that women had a degree of resilience that men did not, and Terry might elaborate on that in Q&A. And he brought his colleague, Professor Victor Callan, into the research team, and they've been busily beavering away. Now, all of our members, 102 of them, have been on this journey with us, but we did do something quite different. Normally we would fund research straight from our recurrent budget, but this time we felt that it was such an important issue and we needed to have a much larger kit than we would normally draw upon in terms of money. So Shell came on board and they underwrote 75% of the research cost, and to date we're probably about at $250,000 and counting. And the Department of Local Government and Communities came on board with EY, Westpac and Worley Parsons, so I thank all of them. What we did was we asked each of the funding partners to put forward a male and female for the steering committee. So you'll see some very familiar faces there out of those brands. You'll also see Liz Ritchie and Suzanne Arder. So Liz at CEDA and Suzanne at AICD had been very active in this gender space, and we thought it was very important to have their support and insights in the project too. So as I said, 173 people interviewed, many of you in the room today. And we spoke to chairs right down to graduate level and also to the women who had opted out of corporate life. And I have to say the thing that surprised me most was, and even today continues to surprise me, is how nervous people were about talking about this issue. Men felt that they needed to be politically correct, and women just don't want to be the Trojan horse for this issue. So anonymity was guaranteed, and I think because of that we got a very rich set of insights, and I'm now going to invite Terry up to the stage to talk to you about those in detail.
Thank you, Marion. It's a pleasure to be here after 3 years on this journey to actually make it to this room, to be able to share the findings with you. 173 interviews is a lot of interviews. It equates to 173 hours of transcript and translates to 3,500 A4 single-space 12-pitch pieces of paper, which I've been over many, many times, so you can tell that I've looked at a lot. But when we were approaching the different groups, we made some decisions. There were several questions that we wanted to ask everyone, all 173 people. And then there were some groups that we wanted to ask specific questions. So I'm going to talk to that very, very briefly. To chairpersons and managing directors, principally what we were looking for was, what are you actually looking for when you hire an executive or you're contemplating putting someone on the board? What are the prime criteria? And one thing that was said over and over and over again, when we're looking at an executive or an appointment to the board, we want people who have had operational experience, deep, broad operational experience. And it came through over and over again. One of the other questions that we asked, and in fact this was asked of everyone, was how they defined gender equality. And we explored that issue, but also the importance of the issue to the different groups. One of the probably the most important things to come out of the interviews with chairpersons and managing directors was that gender equality was not seen to be a strategic imperative in the firms that they led. which I found to be quite surprising. In terms of interviewing the executive recruiters, primarily we were looking to validate what they were being told in executive search and board search. Basically, they said the exact same thing, operational roles, looking for that kind of experience. We also explored with executive recruiters, given that they have such a broad input into all the different selections across Perth, perhaps they could suggest some kind of solution to the problem, or solutions, or the things that they see as recurring all the time. So we collected some fantastic information from the executive recruiters and also HR professionals around what more could be done around the issue. Our core cohorts were female CEOs and senior executives and senior women and middle managers. From these groups, we were looking for the bulk of the answers. From female CEOs and senior executives, we were primarily looking at what the critical issues were across their career. What were the things that they encountered time and time again, and more particularly, how did they overcome those particular issues? So, for all of the women that we interviewed, with the exception of the graduate cohort, we asked them what advice they would give to women starting out in their career. And in fact, the third part of our recommendations is based primarily on the responses that we got from that group of 100 women. From female middle and senior managers who are in that journey, or very much in the middle of that journey, we were looking to explore barriers to progression. What were the current barriers that they were facing every day? And were we hearing the same things from this cohort? And indeed we were. So I want to explore three different themes that we encountered in the research. The first was Western Australia's corporate culture. I must say, from the feedback that I've had from those women that have read this report, that none of this comes as a great surprise to them at all. So bear with me if you've heard this all before. One of the things that was very clear very early on is that the corporate culture of Western Australia is perceived to be more masculine than that of the East Coast. And in fact, the great majority of female interviewees had lived and worked on the East Coast or overseas. Those that were born and bred in Perth understood that there was an issue. Those that had come to Perth were appalled by the issue. They were confronted by the difference in the culture, particularly those that had come from perhaps England or Europe. One of the things that's obvious about Western Australia is it is dominated by the mining, energy and construction sectors, and those sectors in themselves are comprised roughly of about 85% male. So it should come as no great surprise that a masculine culture dominates in the corporate sector. One of the other findings is that 1 in 3 women who were interviewed reported a pervasive community attitude, so in their social setting, that if a woman was married and didn't need to work, she shouldn't work. This was particularly the case for Perth-born women. Those women that had immigrated to Perth were quite astounded by this attitude. They couldn't reconcile it, but nonetheless it was true. One of the other key findings is that the corporate networks in Perth were reported as being masculine, strong and very tight, and female access to these networks was perceived to be extremely limited. Now, it wasn't deliberate exclusion. What was happening, more often than not, was it took the form of exclusion from informal meetings, perhaps at the pub after work. And what was being discussed there were key decisions, clients, winning new work, sharing opportunities with each other. Because these were informal networking occasions, the firm really had no control over what was going on, but nonetheless, women were not present. Not being present then, they were missing out on the opportunities to discuss key decisions that were coming up, and perhaps more importantly, to win new work. We made a decision midway into the project to include a graduate cohort. It wasn't part of our original plan, but we were hearing certain things that made us wonder whether we should have included them from the beginning. And I'm very, very glad we made the decision to include a graduate cohort so that we went from graduate right to CEO. One of the disturbing findings, I think, and this applies not just to WA but to Australia in general, was virtually all of the female graduates reported negative attitudes towards women working in the STEM fields, that is science, technology, engineering and math. And this wasn't anything new. They'd been receiving pressure since they were in high school about undertaking those kinds of careers from parents, from friends, even from teachers, questioning why they would want to go into those fields. But it didn't stop there. They get into university, and the male colleagues or peers in their classroom are actually saying, look, why would you want to do this? The stories are filtering down from industry to the graduates about the different kinds of discrimination that are going on in the field that they're planning to go into. And many of the female graduates actually reported that many of their friends decided to opt out of engineering for that very reason. So quite disturbing. A very strong finding, which again should come as no great surprise, was that the double bind was present. So respondents reported that organisations in Perth value stereotypical male traits of assertiveness, independence and agency. However, if a woman were to use those kinds of behaviours, she was evaluated negatively. So there's a double bind. But if you act collaboratively and stereotypically as a woman, you're also punished for that too because you're too soft. And this narrow range of behaviours makes it almost impossible for a woman to win in those kinds of environments. The double bind is a well-researched phenomenon globally, but it was heightened in Perth. I think perhaps one of the more alarming of the findings in this particular study, but again, it's known in the Western world, is that virtually every executive recruiter, HR professional and woman that we interviewed perceived men to have more self-confidence and to be better at self-promotion than women. Now that came predominantly from a female cohort. There was a very strong consensus around this issue. And it's interesting because in my CEO research, there are only 46 female CEOs of ASX companies. All of the CEOs that we interviewed said the same thing. So this isn't Perth-centric. But it's disturbing because in terms of career progression, you have to put your hand up. You have to lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg says, if you want that next opportunity, if you want that next promotion or that progression in the firm. So it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. So I want to have a look at some particular workplace experiences now. So again, we hear a lot about mentoring. It certainly came up in the CEO research that we did, and again, replicated with our executive cohort in this study. And that is more than 50% of the female executives that we interviewed reported that mentors and sponsors had played a key or pivotal role in their career. That was certainly the case for the CEOs that we interviewed in the previous research. What was disturbing though is that when we go down to the next cohort, so our middle and senior managers, our opt-out cohort and our graduates, very few of them had mentors. And we know that mentors play a pivotal role in progression, so we need to do more in this space as well. Something else that we encountered was that most of the respondents said that the firms that they work for had no clear or visible pathway for progression. What that means is that you're reliant on managers or networks or mentors to provide guidance in terms of your career progression. But we've already said that networks are limited in terms of their access, and most of the females did not have mentors, which means that if there's not a visible pathway for progression, men are advantaged in being able to pick up this information through their mentoring and their networks. In terms of discrimination, half of the female interviewees reported that they had received direct discrimination during their career. In fact, most of the female cohort could describe things that had happened in the past 10 years. What's interesting is when we interviewed the chairs and the managing directors, most of them said that direct discrimination was a thing of the past. And in fact, if there was anything that prompted us to go to that graduate cohort and ask them the same questions, it was that particular issue. It turned out that the graduate cohort had suffered direct discrimination in their 3 to 5 years in the workplace. And perhaps more disturbing was that the worst incidences of direct discrimination were actually in that cohort. So direct discrimination is certainly present. I must say, though, that every cohort noted that it is declining, and it has declined in the last 10 years. Over 90% said that they had suffered indirect discrimination. That is, that they'd suffered through differing forms of indirect discrimination, not being present at meetings that are held at different times, being ostracised from particular meetings. What's interesting, though, in the literature, but it was also coming out in the interviews, is that indirect discrimination actually seems to be on the rise. And one of the reasons given for that is the clampdown from a legislative point of view around direct discrimination. So while that is declining, indirect forms of discrimination still seem to be on the rise. So in terms of work-life conflict, which is our third category that I wanted to have a look at, The two greatest contributors for women leaving the workforce or failing to progress were identified as a lack of childcare or a lack of workplace flexibility. And certainly one of the reasons we looked at our opt-out cohort was to examine why those women were leaving the workforce. Well, the great majority of women in that cohort met both of those criteria. But interestingly, the great majority of those women who had stayed in the workforce also relayed the role pressure that they suffer between work and family. And that this pressure, if it's heightened, can result in their leaving. Very early on, in fact, I think it was in the first interview, and I've probably relayed this story to half of you who've seen me present before, was a story about childcare. And we were sitting at Ernst & Young and we were looking out the window. There's a childcare centre near the BHP Centre. And the interviewee was saying, I've just taken my child out of that childcare centre and I'm putting them in the other one. And I said, don't you mean another one? No, the other one. And I thought, what, there's only 2 childcare centres in Perth? Well, apparently that's true. It's still true. So there's a problem. The interviewees were reporting a lack of availability of childcare places in Perth, and more particularly before and after school care being highly patchy. And this was supported when we went to FactBase to find out the statistics. WA has the lowest per capita number of childcare places in Australia. And childcare forms one of the 4 pillars that primary carers rely upon in staying in the full-time workforce. So that's a major problem. Half of the interviewees said that their organisations had diversity and flexibility policies, which is actually above the national average. WGEA in their gender equity scorecard last year said that only about 43% of organisations have those policies. However, very few were able to report that their firms had strategies to operationalise these kinds of policies. And again, that's in line with the research that the Workplace Gender Equity Agency found. Very few are actually operationalising those policies. I think for me personally, this was one of the most disturbing of the findings, and that is 90% of the female respondents who had undertaken flexible roles said that their career had gone on hold while they were holding those roles, even where they were working 4 days a week. What was disturbing is that they'd left the workforce and come back not to an operational role. They were often shunted to a support role. They received no training or no career development. There was no discussion of career progression, and they were usually underpaid relative to their previous role. I think that's shocking. It's not unique to Perth either. This is a problem we have in Australia with flexible work, and there's certainly some recommendations around that phenomenon. If we were looking for something that's unique to Western Australia, this is it. There's a perfect storm. When I talked about the 4 pillars that are required to support a primary carer staying in the workforce, these are they. Primary carers rely upon spouse support, family support, external childcare providers, or a flexible employer, or a combination of those. In Western Australia, as Marion has said, we have the highest FIFO workforce per capita. Not only this, because of the distance of Perth relative to other cities around the world, we have more people having to be not present overnight to travel to the East Coast or overseas headquarters. So per capita, there are fewer spouses available for childcare. In terms of family support, Western Australia has the highest immigrant female working population between the ages of 20 and 40. 42% of the female working population has immigrated to Perth in the last 10 years. They don't bring their extended family, they just bring their nuclear family. So grandparents, aunts and uncles, etc. aren't available for childcare. Queensland's the next closest state with 34%, so a big difference. We've already talked about the lack of external childcare places, and we were able to look at the exact numbers. Western Australia is by far the lowest per capita number. And to top it all off, so our 4th pillar that I'm about to knock over, the worst industries for flexible employment practices are mining, construction and energy. So there's the perfect storm, and it's something that's unique to Western Australia. And it certainly came through anecdotally in the interviews as well, as to the difficulties women were facing with before and after school care, trying to find it, whether it was patchy, in fact trying to find a place. Many women were trying to come back to the workforce but couldn't, because they couldn't find those places. So in terms of the recommendations, I'm going to move forward onto those now. We were able to workshop those with 350 people through 10 groups, but only after our 16-person steering committee had critically analysed every one of the recommendations from the point of view of the experiences that they had had in their firms. I must say, I think it's probably the most rigorous process I've ever heard of in terms of research, and it'll be great when we go to publish this in the academic journals. So let's have a look at the report. We identified in the report some facilitators, but quite a few more barriers in terms of progressing this issue. There's a very strong economic argument out there, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but it's well established. I think the days of trying to argue that there isn't a connection between more women in senior roles and high profitability are gone. I'd be happy to debate that with anyone. The second facilitator, and this is unique to Perth, is that you've got a highly engaged, tight, entrepreneurial business culture. It means that if the community in Perth decided to tackle this issue, it could happen far more quickly, far more effectively than probably any city in Australia. So that's definitely a facilitator. The businesses here are agile. In terms of barriers, well, we have a national problem in terms of the rising gender pay gap and issues around the treatment of gender, and this being considered a social and diversity issue and not so much an economic one. It certainly is. We have an issue with access to childcare, which is a structural issue that can really only be addressed by government, both federal and state. There is a traditional culture with a prevailing attitude that stands in the way of progress on this issue. And we have a very small pool of female engineers and STEM subject graduates coming through the pipeline. In fact, in terms of engineering roles, it's 14.8%. But again, Perth is not unique here. That's the national average is 15%, so very close to that average. So even if we were to fix the problem tomorrow, it will be a generation or more before those women find themselves in senior operational roles and perhaps executive roles. So those are our barriers. So the recommendations, there are 31 of them. They are not sitting in isolation. We've created a roadmap, a strategic roadmap for change. It's a holistic approach and it's all interconnected. The bottom line is you can't cherry pick one and hope to make a change. And I think if you're wondering, there are lots of good firms out there doing some amazing things in this space, but still wonder why they've plateaued in terms of the issue. I think this is the reason, is that you can try and tackle this piecemeal, but you're not going to get very far. Most organisations understand the importance of a strategic approach with all other things. I think it's time they took a strategic approach with gender equality. So the roadmap takes that approach. So we've divided into three parts: what government can do, what organisations can do, and what women can do. Why did we involve government in this? Well, quite simply, it's a society-wide problem, and society-wide problems can usually only be tackled at society-wide levels. And the West Australian government certainly has a role to play when it comes to tackling culture. So in terms of specific recommendations, the first one is the West Australian government needs to investigate and remedy the number and cost of childcare places, as well as the provision of before and after school care programs. There needs to be a campaign to raise awareness of cultural norms holding women back from contributing to the economy. And that wouldn't be a first. In fact, in the United States right now, there are ad campaigns running on this very issue that are very effective in changing public opinion. We also need the government to intervene in our schools to develop a program to increase the number of girls undertaking STEM subjects. And that goes hand in hand with that idea of erasing cultural norms, because it's not just teachers and schools that are causing this issue, it's parents reinforcing what girls are good at and what boys are good at. There's plenty of research out there to say that there isn't a difference between boys and girls when it comes to the ability to undertake STEM subjects. So they're the key roles for government. Organisations sit in the middle of this conundrum, so we'll have a look at them next. So the first recommendation is that firms need to embrace the economic argument. There are some very compelling economic reasons for doing this. Over the last decade, we've seen a wave of studies, both international and national, that look at the causal links between the number of women in board roles and executive roles and firm profitability. Catalyst, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs have gone over this and over this. The data and the evidence are there. In fact, last year's G20 summit, one of the key things to come out of that is that the summit recognised that gender participation, women's participation in the workforce, is the greatest inhibitor to economic progress in the Western world. So that's our world leaders pointing to this as well. I think one of the most important bits of information to come out was an Australian study looking at GDP foregone by not tackling this problem. And it's backed onto the OECD study that came out in 2007. Goldman Sachs said that if we were to solve this problem, we would increase Australian GDP by 20%. $300 billion. $300 billion. You know that debt crisis we have? Gone in the matter of a year. But we don't hear about it. I'm not entirely sure why firms don't seem to see this as an economic issue. It certainly is. The second recommendation is that change has to be driven from the top. It can't be delegated by the board or the CEO. It must be run by the board and the CEO. One of the things that we found, again in the CEO research, but again in this research, was that most organisations engage in succession planning, certainly in the top layers of the firm. Most organisations have diversity policies, but very few link these two problems. So the recommendation is that they have to be linked and they must go deep, in fact, all the way to the graduate intake. So succession and diversity are issues that are considered together from graduate to CEO level. Marion mentioned quotas, and this is a bit of a journey because it's an old debate. There are very strong advocates on both sides of the debate. Europe and the EU countries are certainly heading down the quotas path. England's resisting and has adopted targets with teeth, and America sits in the middle somewhere, not buying in on it. So what have we recommended? Well, one thing I can say, every single cohort from graduates to senior women to executive women to chairs, executive recruiters were all strongly opposed to quotas. All of them. In fact, there was no group where it was even marginal. It was a very strong view. So we weren't going to go against that view. We had a good look at targets with teeth. We looked at what some good firms were doing around this space. Now, targets with teeth have several advantages over quotas. Perhaps the greatest advantage is that targets can be adapted to local conditions, but they have to be underpinned by rigorous research around what the particular conditions are in that area. You then have to develop a stretch goal, a true stretch goal from where you are at the moment with a deep understanding of what the inhibitors might be. And critically, the CEO must be held accountable and given KPIs by the board to reach those targets. That's what targets with teeth represent. In fact, the report goes into about 5 pages on it, but that's the summary. To back all of this up, there must be gender metrics collected, not just gender pay gap data, but a raft. In fact, we talk about 12 different gender metrics that need to be collected. One of the key recommendations in the report is that every firm needs to conduct a gender pay audit in the next 12 months and to report its findings back to its employees. At present, less than 25% of firms in Australia conduct a gender pay audit. One of the startling findings by WGEA last year was that even though 24% had conducted it, only 1.6 made any change upon finding there was a gender pay gap. Interestingly enough, of all the respondents in this study, all the firms that had undertaken a gender pay gap found one. So it's not a myth, they were there when they looked. The accountability for reaching these targets with teeth have to flow across the organisation through managers, through every layer of the firm. That is, through appropriate KPIs at every level. We've recommended that large firms consider the provision of on-site childcare. That we also recommend that developers of new buildings and of precincts also include in their planning a childcare facility. SMEs, there's a raft of recommendations in the report about how they can support childcare without actually providing a childcare centre. And again, we have a dozen recommendations for SMEs about what they can do, mainly from information provided by people within the research. We recommend that firms re-examine the need for travel, whether meetings can be conducted over electronic media. The extent of travel in Western Australia between FIFO and between executives needing to go to other cities is quite pronounced, and we believe this would make a difference. Honest Conversations is actually around maternity leave. We found that there were some organisations that were handling this very well. They'd come up with a suite of policies that actually had shown a marked improvement in the number of women returning to work after having children. And it was pretty simple, really. It was about having an honest conversation. So the conversation started at the point at which the woman wanted to take maternity leave. The conversation was around aspirations, around what they anticipated that would look like when they might return to work, what kind of work they would like to do upon their return. During their absence, the firm maintained contact. It was a critical component of this policy, that they were looking to make sure that that person didn't feel that they were being ostracised or exited from the workforce. They did that through invitations to social functions, but also development functions as well. The third phase of it was, upon return to work, having a conversation to see whether the aspirations were still the same, what kind of work that they would like to be engaged in, and those conversations continued for months and even years in those flexible roles. They found that those policies had made a tremendous difference in their retention rates. Flexibility strategies, as we said, was one of the most disturbing parts of the research, was what was going on with flexible work. In the report, we recommend that every single role where there is a request for flexibility be subjected to job analysis and job design to look at whether that work can be conducted flexibly, that is, including operational roles. One of the other things is that there needs to be oversight of managerial discretion when it comes to the granting of flexible work practices. Telstra, as you may be aware, has adopted the position that all roles are flexible. That's their starting position in Telstra. ACOM, I believe, is also going down that track. One of the key things that must be considered in any flexibility option is career progression. That conversation must happen in every flexible role, and again, that's a recommendation of the report. Some of the stories that we heard around pay, progression, recruitment, led us to believe that there's a lot of unconscious bias still occurring out there. And this isn't just necessarily a Western Australian problem, it goes on across the Western world. All pay, promotion and recruitment policies need to be reviewed with an eye to unconscious bias. Some simple things such as making sure that there is a female panellist, making sure that a female is on the shortlist. Those simple kinds of policies can be enacted pretty quickly. As I talked about, there needs to be documented pathways for progression, and I went through the reasons for that. None of this can happen without everyone being involved. It's a major change, it's a strategic change, it's a holistic change. That means that every policy that's devised, the reason why we're adopting a strategic approach, has to be trained. If managers and CEOs and staff are going to collectively try and tackle this problem, they need to all be on the same page. So training and development has to be coordinated around those policies. Sponsorship and mentoring needs to be initiated in the firm. Formal mentoring. We talk a lot in the report about the different kinds, so informal mentoring, sponsorship, formal mentoring, but they all play a pivotal role in the progression of women, and so we've gone into detail there. Where possible, certainly awareness of exclusivity of networking is important, but where possible, the firm needs to make sure that when it has formal networking occasions, that these are inclusive and consider both genders. So the recommendations for women, and I want to preface this first, they differ in that the first part of the report deals with how we can bring the world to a place where we'd like it to be. The recommendations for women were based upon the 100 reports that we got and advice from the women that participated in the research. They were backed up by an extensive review of the literature, and as you grab the report today, you'll see all of these recommendations are backed in the literature. So the advice is, how do I progress in the world as it exists today, not the world we'd like it to be? So let's have a look at these recommendations. The first, and I think one of the most important, is to start with the end goal in mind. That is, what does the end of my career look like? What are the kinds of experiences I will have had to secure an executive role, a CEO role, or a board role? When will I get those? Where will I get those? Who will support me in getting those? These are all questions. And if you have that end goal in mind and you can map what that looks like, you're off to a great start. The second, and I think, again, one of the major, certainly important recommendations that came out of the 100 interviews with women is be true to yourself. Don't fall into the trap of adopting male stereotypical behaviours to progress in a male-dominated environment. It doesn't work. The research that we had into female CEOs, research that's ongoing in America, suggests that the double bind is best navigated by being authentic, being true to yourself, and using the stereotypical behaviours or the normal behaviours that you would ordinarily use. Yes, there are penalties for being too soft, but it is far better to navigate the double bind from that perspective. Self-confidence, as I said, came up over and over again, not only in this study, but in the previous study. Sheryl Sandberg talks about it. It's a known issue. And in discussing where that might have come from, a lot of the conversations went back to childhood and the kinds of things boys are allowed to do. Boys aren't allowed to cry, those kinds of things. And it actually develops then into a gender difference in the perception of self-confidence. So the one clear thing in the research literature is that there is no innate difference between men and women when it comes to self-confidence. There is nothing that would explain it genetically or otherwise. It's purely socially constructed. So the report identifies through the 100 interviews advice by 100 successful women about how to navigate this particularly difficult issue. The report recommends that when you attend functions like this, and I'm led to believe that it's 70-30 today, 70% women, 30% men, that the women should all bring a male colleague, preferably their boss, to these kinds of functions. And you'd be surprised and make them report back. Don't give them a free ride. They've got to go back to the organisation and report on what they heard. And in fact, some of the most prominent male champions of change were engaged in this debate and are now advocates for the process because a woman in their organisation invited them along to a function like this. So it's a key piece of advice and recommendation from us. Plan around family. Until men can have children, this will be an issue. And it goes something like this, and very few people do it, and it's because it's not probably the best thing to do on your first date. But at some point before committing, you need to have this conversation around what happens when we have children. What's going to happen to my career? How's that going to affect your career? How are we going to navigate this? I want to have a career, and I know you do too. So what are we going to do? How are we going to map this out? The first thing would be to gauge their response, see what happens. But make those plans. Be strategically opportunistic. When we spoke to particularly the executive cohort, and I know in the previous study we did on female CEOs, there were pivotal moments. If you go back to that first recommendation about knowing what the end goal looks like, then you're prepared to see the opportunity when it arises. You will recognise it for what it is. The important part is to also, in your life, be ready for when that opportunity might be occurring. So most of those key opportunities happen early, fairly early, certainly in the CEO success stories that we looked at, and again in the executive cohort that we looked at in this study. So being strategically opportunistic is being able to A, recognise the opportunity, and B, being able to act upon it. We also go into great detail about how women navigate self-promotion and meaningful networks, and there's a tremendous amount of advice there about how to maintain those and to develop those. We talk again about how and where sponsors are required and mentors, again from the executive experience and also from the research that we've conducted into CEOs. There's some tremendously good advice about where these mentors and sponsors come from. They don't just magically appear. You can certainly manage that process. And the last recommendation, and I think it's a key one, is that each woman who is in a position to mentor another should mentor another. If every woman in this room were to adopt one other woman under their wing and to share their experiences, we would have doubled the number of role models in Perth. And there's one thing a man cannot do as a mentor or a sponsor, and that is to show another woman how to lead as a woman. Role models are critical in overcoming this issue. And so we would ask that each of you take on the sponsoring or mentoring of at least one other woman. So these recommendations are holistic. They're a strategic roadmap. We've actually tested this, as Marion said, with Rosabeth Moss-Cantor. I've spoken to Alice Eagley over in the United States, both of whom are world leaders in this field. And I've had a look at this as well. This seems to be the first time there's been a roadmap provided to business about how to tackle this problem strategically and holistically. So with that, I'll pass over to Michael Schock for his comments on the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and indeed, thank you, Marion. So this moment, 2 years in the making, is something that you should both be really proud of. I'm pretty happy to be here today. In Shell, I work for an organisation that asks its leaders to ensure that diversity be at the heart of our business plans in the same way that safety is. Indeed, we view diversity as a necessary precondition for success. We've been in Australia for nearly 12 decades. Perth is now our Australian headquarters. Our people are here, our suppliers and contractors are here, our stakeholders are here, indeed our future is here. So we're all too well aware of the fact that Australia compares poorly vis-a-vis other OECD countries with regard to the participation of women at senior levels in organisations, and that in turn Perth compares unfavourably vis-a-vis the rest of the country. At Shell, women constitute just over a third of our workforce, but only a fifth of our leaders, and we wish to get better. When approached in early 2013 to underwrite the project, we understood that Dr. Fitzsimmons would move past the quantitative, the what, and to seek to understand the why and the how. A qualitative study undertaken with a really, really tight geographic focus that may just shine a light on the path forward to a more productive economy within a more just environment. So it was put to me by my boss at the time, a lady called Anne Pickard, that if I understood what the issue was, it was then incumbent upon me to do something about it. It was a challenge to step up, as nothing would change until male leaders, particularly those in the resources industry, prosecuted that change. Indeed, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? Because the issue isn't one of gender, the issue is one of leadership. The report reminds me of the compelling economic argument for gender diversity. At an organisational level, I knew that already, with the business case validated by attracting, affiliating and motivating top talent, increasing productivity and ultimately impacting our licence to operate and grow. I also know that when our partners, our contractors and suppliers, our stakeholders are better in this space, then Shell is the better for it. I knew that because I've witnessed that in the safety space. When all of those around us are better, Shell is the better for it. And then the report reminds me of the tight, engaged, entrepreneurial business culture that we have here in Perth. I knew that. We all know that. Sometimes a weakness, but other times a great strength. And if you agree with me that this is not a gender issue, but an issue of leadership, then our tight, engaged and can-do business culture is a gift. If the most influential men in Perth were to adopt and implement the recommendations of this report, to prosecute the actions outlined in the roadmap, the unshakable truth is the effects would be profound and would be felt immediately. We know that as well. So therein lies our challenge. I am extremely comfortable that we've satisfied the project's aims of establishing a clear understanding of the corporate landscape in here in Perth, a understanding of the similarities and differences with the rest of the country, and identifying what organisations can do and what women can do for themselves. What I can't assure you of is whether we'll capture the benefits that we sought when the project was initiated. Greater participation by women at senior levels in organisation, more female leaders, stem the loss of women in that critical period 10 years after graduation, and ultimately redressing the gender balance so that we have a more productive economy within a more just environment. What I do know is this: we will capture those benefits, if we collectively choose to prosecute the report's roadmap of actions. So I say this particularly to the gentleman. I invite you to lead, yeah? If not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you for listening to me.
You can see why Mike has been a wonderful chair of our project steering committee and a wonderful support to me. He's been passionate throughout, he's been supportive throughout, so thank you very much, Mike. Now I'm going to ask the Minister for Women's Interest to come up to the stage and make a comment on behalf of government, and I'd also like to officially give her the first copy of the report, and we hope to capture that on the camera. And you can just see some yellow sticky notes up there, which we're going to leave up for the rest of the session. And that's just comments of congratulation and the difference that business leaders think the report will make. Minister. Here's Chris. So there you go. Here he comes.
Thanks very much, Marion. It's my great pleasure to be here as Minister for Women's Interests in the Western Australian Government to receive a copy of this Filling the Pool groundbreaking report. My congratulations to Terry Fitzsimmons, Marion, Michael Schock, all of the people that have been involved in putting this report together, and also, importantly, the people who've contributed to the report. I guess it's already been articulated by Terry in his presentation, why this is important. We know that if we're going to be a leading economy into the future, we have to lift the participation rate of women in our workforce. And the only way we're going to achieve that is if government partners with all of the sectors, the community sector, with the education sector, with the corporate sector, to try and achieve a common goal. Obviously, a society that appreciates diversity, rewards companies with prosperity for taking on the diversity challenge. Those are the companies that are going to have the cutting edge, they're going to be innovative. That is going to be the society that is the leading society in our region, and that's actually where we need to be in Western Australia. So when we have a look at the actions for government out of this report, I'll be working very closely with Minister Tony Simpson, who's responsible for looking at childcare and seeing what it is we can do as a government to supplement the initiatives that have already been announced by the federal government with their $3.5 billion injection into childcare. Every single working woman in this room, and probably some of the men too, know that that is a critical issue that needs to be addressed if we're going to lift participation for women in the workforce. So what we need to be looking at is how do we facilitate the opening of childcare places, how do we facilitate new daycare centres coming online. One of those areas that I've certainly been looking at as Minister also for Training and Workforce Development is having a look at some of our state training colleges and seeing what we can do there by facilitating and encouraging the workforce to be working in those childcare centres. I was recently down at the Peel campus of the Challenger Institute, where we've opened a brand new facility there, and they actually have a state-of-the-art daycare facility for training. The people that are using that facility at the moment, we do actually have some lecturers and students on the campus who are able to have their children be looked after in that facility by the childcare workers that are being trained. Those are the sorts of innovative solutions that we need to find and that we need to encourage if we're going to make a difference in this space. And I'll endeavour to keep pushing any opportunities that I see in my portfolio areas to increase those opportunities for women and families to take advantage of and encourage the opening of new childcare places. The other area, of course, is in talking about it. There'll be a few people in this room who know me who'll say, yes, you do enough of that, but that is key. We need to keep this issue on the agenda and we need to keep the discussion rolling along. And what is really important about this report is that it actually validates what so many women have been experiencing in Western Australia as they try to embark on their careers and progress through the ranks. Now, this is a validation of what we've experienced, and it's a call to action to end the nonsense and start working on how to get that gender diversity in our companies and through our government streams as well. The third area is looking at how do we get more girls and women into science, technology, engineering and maths areas. I've already taken your advice, Terry. I've involved the boss. So I have engaged with the Premier in a number of forums where we've first looked at science, technology, engineering and maths. How do we get more female participation in those areas? And you're quite right, it starts with our children in our schools, encouraging girls to take on the dirty jobs. Because in actual fact, when you get out in the workplace, they're not that dirty, and you can earn a bucket load of money more if you get into them. So I'm all for that. I've got a 15-year-old daughter. She needs to be looking after me when she grows up. Also, the next forum that I have with the Premier is looking at at retaining talent in the workforce. How do we retain women? How do we keep them engaged in the workplace conversation? What do we need to do in partnership with government, the corporates, all of our sectors? How do we retain that talent and not lose that corporate knowledge? So that's the next forum with the Premier, and the Premier is an active participant in those forums, and he's really enjoyed his participation to date. So I'll make sure that that stays on his agenda too. So in closing, what I'd like to say also is congratulations to the 30% of the men who are making up this audience today. I'd like to put it on the record that you are the smartest men in Perth. You have seen that there is an opportunity, and in coming to this presentation today, in understanding what's been achieved in this report, what's been discovered, and what these recommendations are. Now, you can work with the women on your tables and the women in your organisations to try and get those targets in place in your organisations and work on getting to that future place where gender diversity isn't a conversation that we're having anymore. It's just part of life, and it exists. For our children, for our girls and for our boys, I have a 13-year-old son as well, and when my son has a family, I actually want him to have some choices and some flexibility in his workplace so that he can spend some time with his children. And we need this is a family issue. It is not just a women's issue, and we need to take it on as a family and as a society, and that's how we're going to win. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It doesn't surprise me that we've packed the room. People have been talking about this report for 2 years. I'm really pleased to have actually had a little bit of a glimpse at the report before I came here today. But I recommend reading it and taking it on. Let's start on this roadmap and start putting our goals and our goalposts ahead of us and giving ourselves those stretch targets to achieve our full potential and the full potential of the next generation coming through. Thank you.
It's really been great to have government as a partner in this project. We've learnt so much, I have to say, and particularly the childcare issue. It's so vexed. Local, state and federal all have a role to play. So we look forward to getting a formal response. Now, Terry and Michael, it's your chance, and it feels very strange saying Mike or Michael because I call him Shocky, and I think most of you who know him do. So please come to the stage, and we're going to get on with Q&A. And the girls tell me that I run such a dreadful Q&A session that they're going to boss me around and tell me who's next on the list. So I'm just going to look out there and look for the right person to tell me who I need to ask the question to. So, gents, if you could come up. Yep, microphone's on, I think. Yes? All right, first question. Who am I looking at? Now, there's a woman... Oh. Microphone's coming your way. Georgie's bringing it to you.
This is a bit scary to go first. My name's Hannah Fitzharding. I'm the Program Director of the Integral Women in Leadership Program. Congratulations, this is an amazing report. My question, I like the facilitator being about having a really innovative entrepreneurial culture. And I just wonder, noticing the economic downturn now and I suppose the lack of adoption of flexible work practices, what you think the gap might be there between that culture and the ability to actually pick up flexibility and part-time work for men and for women and value it, particularly with the economic downturn. So I'd be really interested in your comment. Thank you.
I think I've actually had that question posed to me before. Because of the economic downturn, will this get put on the back burner? I think what we've tried to establish in the report is this is actually a growth mechanism. This is a mechanism for overcoming those kinds of economic issues. So if anything, the downturn should be a catalyst for the adoption of these policies rather than an excuse not to.
Can I maybe add to that, yeah? Until these practices are adopted ubiquitously, I'd view it as a source of strategic competitive advantage. Yeah, those that choose to get after this actually are ahead of the game. The business case is quite compelling. It should be indifferent.
Thanks, Hannah, for being the first question. Now we're going over here.
Hi, my name is Damien Burton. I work for a company called Patrick, which is probably one of the last, unfortunately, the last bastions of male dominance in the industrial environment, but we're slowly changing. My question, this report is fascinating, great work to all involved. I'm particularly interested as well, you've clearly focused at the more educated levels, you've gone from graduate upwards. We also struggle to get diversity in our workplace at the blue-collar type roles. How much of the stuff that you've found here would also apply in those realms?
I think it's totally applicable. A lot of the things we found are about workplace culture and about changing culture and stereotypes. So that's just as applicable to blue as to white-collar workers. So I see a direct correlation between the two. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, there was a special, I think a couple of years ago, Hilary Devey was looking at her workforce, which is transport. And they were having great success about getting female drivers. And what they found, and again, I think the mining industry here found the same thing, is that they're actually better at the job, more committed to it, and so it became a no-brainer. And once the first movers had adopted, women were coming into these industries in droves.
Great question. Next. Microphone's coming your way in the middle there.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you, that's dramatic. Helen Peterson, Engineers Australia, so I'm in one of the dirty jobs. Got to say, I haven't had my hands dirty for a very long time. Your recommendations are separated into what government can do, what organisations can do, and what women can do. And one of the big things we've found is actually telling men what they can do. So I'm wondering when the addendum's going to come out, because part of it is men actually taking the effort to understand what the issues are. I was sitting around a table and a video was launched, for example, and the two women around the table went, "Oh," when the video was played, and the men are sitting there going, "What's wrong?" So understanding what it is they're looking at and why it's an issue, I think is really important for men. Advocating for women. Looking at their own networks and thinking about not just who they're mentoring and sponsoring, but who their peers are. So taking women on as their peers. And even things like taking their kids to work when it's Teacher Development Day. You know, be the guy that turns up at the office with the young kids to sit at their desk instead of it always being mum who takes them to work. So I'm just wondering when the addendum's coming out.
Well, I think fair to say that the head of most organisations in Perth are men, so it's basically for organisations and their leaders, in brackets, men.
I couldn't have said it better.
Another question? There's one hand right at the back.
Hi, I think I've got a microphone, so I'll jump in. Kelly McKenzie from CBH Group. Really fantastic report. Looking forward to
going through all of it. But my question was really around the overcoming unconscious biases. So you did touch on that. I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, and what were your findings in terms of the best approaches to do that?
Unconscious bias, in fact, I've just done some work with ACOM on it. The unconscious bias actually affects everything. It's just I think it's a label. It's getting a lot of airplay. But unconscious bias is really just talking about the societal level effects, the things that we just assume. So it's about dispelling myths. It's about disconfirming stereotypes. Where organisations engage in unconscious bias training, and there's a fair bit of it out there at the moment, what it's really about is actually addressing things or behaviours or systems, processes that people are unaware of have an effect, or a particular effect on one group versus another. So making what is unconscious conscious is probably the most important part of unconscious bias training. But it's certainly having an effect where it's being implemented in all the organisations that I'm aware of, and it's certainly part of what we're recommending as a suite of training exercises in the adoption of the recommendations.
Could I offer a personal view there? If I reflect on my colleagues and my friends, and I grew up here in Perth, so most of my friends are here in Perth, yeah, they'd be horrified to be called a misogynist, yeah, that would be quite offensive, yeah. But you do have to point out, here are the outcomes we're getting, yeah, so here's the value, and there's the outcome. Reflect on that enormous gulf, and therefore what actions will you take?
In the middle, I think someone's got a microphone.
I've got a microphone, I'll go. My name's Sharon Warburton. I'm an executive and non-executive director in the construction and resource industries, 2 of the 3 sectors that you discussed today. I'm delighted to share with you that I was one of the people interviewed and very, very happy to participate in the research. I wondered if the audience could help answer my question. We heard very strongly, and for which as a leader I very strongly believe in, that we have to lead this issue from the top. So I wondered if we had the chairs and the CEOs in the room, if they could stand up. I'm just curious as to how many are actually here.
There's quite a few, let me tell you.
I wanted you all to join with me in congratulating them for leading Perth in this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And Sharon's in the wonderful position of being awarded the Telstra Businesswoman of the Year award, and you can see why with her leadership capabilities there. Okay. Got one here at the front.
Hi. I'm Erica Hodge. I'm the Content Director at Mix 94.5, and I was at an event in Perth in the last month or so where Ita Buttrose was a keynote speaker, and we were talking about gender equality in particular on boards, and she is an incredibly strong advocate for quotas. So we had the discussion in your presentation about targets with teeth, and that there was an overwhelming negativity from your respondents towards quotas. I'm just curious as to what the thinking was behind that, because I'm not yet at a level of intelligence about either to make an informed decision, I don't feel so.
I'll declare my hand. I'm actually in favour of quotas. So to recommend targets with teeth really required me to go back through the data. It was overwhelming. It wasn't even marginal. And the reasons like this, it's the merit chestnut, if you like. What was being said, and it's the research backs this up very clearly, is that it raises doubt in everyone's mind. The person who's the beneficiary of the appointment wonders whether they got that because of their strengths or whether they got that because they were just a number. And everyone around them, and this is probably more important, undermines that position by actually saying, well, no, you did only get that because. It gives them an excuse to attack, as if there aren't enough excuses to attack. So that was when we were hearing that over and over and over again. It would be crazy to recommend something that's so totally opposed in every sector. Putting my me hat on, I still think that quotas on boards has shown success in Europe. There's no adverse occurrence in Norway. They didn't sink off the planet. Their profitability's as good, if not better, than it's always been. So there are definitely 2 sides to this. But it seems to be English-speaking countries have a particular issue around quotas.
And Terry, also when you were doing the focus groups, you talked about the Norway experience, and although there was quotas reached for board, it didn't make a difference at the CEO level. So do you want to elaborate on that?
I went to the Gender Work and Organisation conference as one of 2 guys in 300 feminists. It was great. But I was in a session with some Norwegian professors, and they were talking about this, that they'd achieved those quotas very quickly. In fact, within 18 months of the cut-off, they were there with their 40% women on boards. But we were talking now 6 years later, and they were asking the room, so how many more CEOs do you think there are now, and how many more female executives? The numbers had not moved at all. They were exactly the same. So by applying quotas at board level, it made absolutely no difference to the underlying issues. And I think that's the reason this report's a holistic one. We have to tackle it at every level. Quotas on boards will fix one problem. It certainly won't fix filling the pool.
Hello.
In the middle there?
Hello, Marion, I'm over here.
Oh,
there
Conrad.
we go. Hi, how's it going? So my name's Conrad Liveris, and I've just got a really simple question, because Terry, you were talking about how we do know all of the information that was being presented. We do know the economic and business case. We know that it's good for society. We know so much, and we've known for a really long time. So my question is really simple. Why aren't we acting?
One word, culture. It's very easy to continue along the old path. And it's very difficult to change. What you need is a catalyst for change. And I think there have been lots of different reports at different times that receive different amounts of exposure. But I'm led to believe this is the first time something like this has been done anywhere in the world that actually pulls together all of the issues and makes a very clear case for how to approach this change. One of the things that was very clear from, I think, some work that Ernst & Young did, Karen might be able to fill me in on this, is that a lot of firms found difficulty. We want to tackle this problem, we're just not entirely sure how. And look, we tried this, and then we tried that, and it didn't seem to make any difference. The difference of this report is, here's the whole picture, and here's a map or a plan for tackling this holistically. And I think that's why we might get some movement. We're actually showing business the way forward.
And if I can talk about it from a Committee for Perth perspective, in 2007, my second board meeting with the organisation, our board resolved that Perth could be the city in Australia that could acknowledge, respect and celebrate Aboriginal people and their culture. And that was seemingly a very easy thing to do, and actually has been quite a journey for us. So we work with the willing. Those organisations that believe in the agenda of the Committee for Perth are members of the Committee for Perth, and that goes without saying. And we de-risked the process. All firms said to us, we would acknowledge traditional owners, but we don't want to cause offence. So we produced a very simple guide with Richard Wally, who's our Indigenous advisor, and all of a sudden the corporate sector were doing welcomes to country like it was second nature. Now, government had been doing it for decades, but it had not transcended then into action in corporate. And that's the same with gender. Government's had affirmative action, quotas, targets, etc., but it hasn't transcended to corporate culture. So that's why I hope this report is actually very different, because we've already had success in the reconciliation space as well.
Marion, sorry, can I just add to that, yeah? Starting with the statement from the ultimate leaders of the organisation is critical. Once that happens, then there's some choices that can be made. When I reflect on the actual actions, which are the roadmap of actions, where we've enacted a number of them, you'll get the outcomes. Our workplace gender pay audit, we've decreased that materially to a quarter of what it was. It's now less than 1%. But you make those things explicit, you make them transparent to your staff, you can actually get the outcome.
Janet, I think you've got the microphone. I believe you've been very active on media this morning.
I just want to go back to the quota business, because I'm a bit on your side with quotas. I think that there are two sides to it. If you join a board because you have to be the token woman, there's an opportunity for the other board members to say, well, you're only here because you're the token woman. But there's also an opportunity for you to shine. And if you take that opportunity, you'll knock their socks off. Because my experience on boards is that the women I've been on boards with have been astonishing people, like Catherine Livingston and so on, work much harder than the men, and they contribute, and when they contribute, it's worth listening to. The other thing is, if you think that this issue has to come from the top, can we do something about our Prime Minister, who thought it was okay to have one woman in his cabinet? Now he's got two.
Couldn't agree more.
Janet's passed it on to me. And that's because I'm about to follow on from what she was talking about. Also, my name's Linda Wayman. I'm the General Manager of Southern Cross Austereo Perth. I was at a dinner, and this issue about women on boards and quotas and so on came up. There was about 20 men and myself and one other woman. And the chap there, one of the chaps there said, well, you know, we don't know if it's on merit if you have a woman. And I looked at him and I said, do you think that I would got this position that wasn't based on merit? And so the pool of the women that are actually going on boards are usually in that position because they've got it totally on merit. And therefore, from a board's point of view, the risk is much smaller appointing a woman. I think the quota issue is a wedge for women and really is not a discussion. I just think that people should use their common sense and look at the potential candidates and how they got into the position that you're using in the first place. So that's my comment.
So because you're 500 of my closest best friends, I'll tell you that it took me 7 years to get appointed as the first woman to Rugby WA board. 7 years of cajoling, pleading, bullying. I have run membership businesses for most of my career. Rugby WA is a membership-based business, and they couldn't see a role for me on the board because I'd never carried a rugby ball across the try line. And at my first board meeting, I came up with what I thought was a really good suggestion. And one of the directors patted my hand and said, that's a great suggestion. And I said, it won't be my last. So sometimes you have to have a bit of a sense of humour as well. Next question, up the back there.
Thank you, Marion. Councillor Fiona Reid, and also Senior Manager in the not-for-profit sector. My question is around, I think it's hard as a woman not to hear some of this and not think of your own context and your own experience. And I wondered if this research is applicable in an ageing population, particularly for women in the middle years who perhaps are in the best opportunity to take on executive roles because their children are grown, and perhaps doing further training and education, etc. Whether it applies in the same way when you've got those gap years and you're competing with your peers, your male peers, who perhaps have had that greater length of tenure in the field, or is that a further piece of research on how those women can progress their careers without hitting the ceiling?
We do tackle that in the report. We do talk about the kinds of things that can be done. It's in the recommendations for women around trying to maintain relevance, maintain contact, continuing education, things that can be done outside the workforce to try and make sure that gap doesn't become too great. And again, that was all advice from the 100 women that were interviewed around, and many of whom had actually taken that gap year or 2 or 5. And there's some very good advice about the things that should be done and borne in mind at the beginning of that time to make the re-entry into the workforce possible at the level that they want to be in. So yes, it is covered.
Probably one of the things to also mention is when we held one of the focus groups, there was quite a lot of pushback about having some sort of setback in your career. If you took an extended piece of time out of work, male or female, there was a sense that you shouldn't be penalised for that. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
There's two, I guess, extremes in point of view. One is that time out of the workforce, doing something else can't be equated in any way as to time in the workforce. And then there's the other view that there are life experiences that you can get outside of the workforce that you can bring back in and they have value. The answer is in between, obviously. it's very difficult to gain the kind of direct experience that's required to run a mine site doing something else, if it's backpacking in Nepal or whatever it happens to be. So I think there are some things that do readily translate. There are some things that don't. I was very interested actually last week to hear that the Australian Army, of all institutions, is actually initiating a process whereby female officers who take time out to have children will be fast-tracked back to the exact same rank as their peers when they re-enter the workforce. That's the Australian Army. And they're taking steps to make sure that the opportunities that they've missed out on will be deliberately given to those female officers so that they can catch up with their peers. So if the Australian Army can do that, I think maybe there's something in that for organisations.
And certainly the Minister and Premier's next forum is very much about how do we get women back into participation and progression, importantly. Okay, next question.
Hi, my name's Anna Dartnell. I run a small operational improvement consulting firm, but I'm also on the board of the Kimberley Ports Authority. And just reflecting on a couple of things that you were talking about. One, I don't think anyone's going to argue about the need to develop women through STEM subjects, but thinking about that question of being strategically opportunistic, I'm not 100% sure that we really need a STEMS background in order to achieve that operational experience that's so important for senior leadership roles. You know, if I take myself, I started in the mining industry with a Bachelor of Arts and I'm now running ports. So, you know, I think whilst we certainly do want to look at that pipeline of development of people through STEMs, are we seeing enough openness to the pathways that can get people into operational roles and what sort of backgrounds, you know, can do a range of different roles in those operational environments?
You're absolutely right. I think what we're doing when we give a report like this and when we talk about it is we talk about the general rather than the specific. There are 100 pathways to executive roles. But one thing that was very, very clear from executive recruiters and chairs alike was that operational experience was critical. In the mining, construction and energy sectors, that operational experience was primarily through progress through STEM subjects into STEM fields. There are 100 different other sectors of the Perth economy. They're just not the dominant ones. And of course, you can get to executive roles without having done a STEM subject. But what we're talking to here is the dominant industries and the majority of people. And while we've got 14.8% female graduates, we've got a problem in those particular sectors.
Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about the graduates? Because you've had success in recent years.
Yeah, we have, and I distinctly remember the discussion about 5 years ago about how many graduates we were taking on. And I think the answer to the question was, let's say it was 10, and how many of those were women, and the answer was 2. So the response to that was, well, if you have 2 women graduates, you're going to get 2 men. Yeah. So immediately, you know, that was the target with teeth. It was very clear as to what our outcome was, and for the last 4 years, we had more than 50%. We've taken a disproportionate share, particularly in the technical disciplines. 62% of our graduates were women last year. Now that doesn't solve the problem, but that gives us a shot at it at the front end. So I see it as a strategic competitive advantage. We still got the task of being able to pull that talent all the way through to those key leadership positions.
Next question. I'm seeing a hand waving. I'm seeing a microphone going somewhere.
Hi, my name's Tracy McDougall. I had a long career in the oil and gas industry. I just wanted to ask a question. You talked about a roadmap and you talked about the government, organisation and women and actions for each of those groups. We, you know, anyone with a project background knows that if any one part of your roadmap doesn't get followed, your project doesn't really go very well. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on what happens if the government or organisations or women, as we talked about, don't follow these actions, and how that impacts on what we would like to see change as a result of this study.
I suppose turning that another way is, what do we hope out of this? And what we really hope for is to see a step change in Perth. You know, if it's 300 years of glacial pace to getting parity at CEO level, Something's got to change around here, and we're all responsible for that. So I think that the people here today have shown an enormous response to the issue, and certainly the people who were interviewed and bared all against their better judgment have provided those insights. But there will be people who will be hostile to this report. Certainly when we started this project, I can tell you I had some very unpleasant conversations with people, including graduate women, who said to me, "You bitter and twisted old feminist, stop raking over these issues. They're gone." And guess what? We found out they haven't gone. So, you know, for us, there will be a step change. That's what we hope for, a step change. And if people are in denial, get the pay audit done, and then you will know if you've got a problem or not. And, you know, at the government level, I think, you know, government's already shown a willingness. And certainly in the focus groups, the pushback mostly came from women about the recommendations for women. And they were saying, well, why should we do anything differently? And you don't have to if you don't want to, but this is the advice of 100 women who are successful, giving you the benefit of their wisdom.
So, Tracy, I'd advocate to control the things that you control. So from an organisational perspective, once a statement of intent is made by the senior leadership in the Leadership Charter, then all of the actions which are recommended are actually quite eminently doable. And indeed, if you wish to benchmark yourself, you'd finish off with the Workplace Gender Equity Agency will come out and offer citations, which they're not exclusively with those particular benchmarks. But if you want to know that you're having some progress, that would be the outcome. There's only 5 companies which are headquartered here in Perth that have got that, and it virtually covers all of those, particularly with Targets with Teeth, all of those actions.
Okay, next one.
Hi, my name's Tina McCall. I'm President of Women Lawyers Western Australia. I have a two-folded question, and the first part of that question is, does the report contain practical tips about implementation? And the second part of that question is there a forum or a discussion group that is available in terms of providing any further practical tips? We find a very difficult cultural change in the area of law. We produced our own report last year with 197 recommendations, and we're following up on the implementation of those at the moment. So the question really is about practical tips in terms of implementing those recommendations.
Certainly the report is incredibly detailed, so I encourage you to read it cover to cover. I had to do that with 3 wines, so you can have a little break in between, but it is incredibly comprehensive in terms of telling you, you know, how to go about doing what you need to do. So the recommendations don't sit there in isolation. In terms of an implementation group, you're the implementation group. You know, in terms of law, there will be companies that will embrace that, and they will become the employers of choice. And women will start making those decisions based on published knowledge and reputation that gets around their networks. And the companies that don't embrace it, well, they might just find themselves with a completely male cohort. Guys, did you want to say anything on that? See, a little bit shy, we've got so many questions in the room, we've probably got time for 3 more. So,
I'm the lucky one. Hello, my name's Marie Gooch. I'm here representing the Rural, Regional and Remote Women's Network. We have a subscriber base of 8,000 people, generally organisations and individuals. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on the report. I have known Marion for a couple of years now. Marion herself, I would like to congratulate. She was involved in a mentoring program that I was involved in. Many of the participants in that program went on to earn another $100,000 profit per business in their SMEs within 1 to 2 years. Special thanks to Marion, because her mentee is now doing incredible things in the grains industry. Please read last weekend's Sunday Times on the people to watch list. I'd also ask that as a board, I've got 2 fellow representatives here from our board, from Margaret River and Bunbury. I'm from the Peel region. I ask that you look outside the square and potentially over the hill or to the north or to the south, and consider that there are a plethora of very educated, very willing and able women who are dying to get on and do things, but because of geographic circumstance, romance, love, all sorts of reasons, they're not actually here in the CBD anymore, but by gee, they're pretty amazing. So I just ask you to consider other ways when you're mentoring people or looking for someone to mentor, and also ladies, mentor men as well. It's really important that we show the way and lead the way. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. To give my experience that Marie's talking about, the Minister for Food and Agriculture asked me if I would mentor one of the bright young farmers from the Narrogin region, and I am such a city slicker. And I thought, how can I help this guy? I don't even know why I've been chosen. And we sat down together and we worked out a plan for 12 months, and the first thing he wanted me to do was come to the farm and meet the family and see what they grew. And yes, they ran sheep, but they also grew very specialist wheat and grain products. And I have to say the welcome from my mentee was great, but from his family was a bit chilly, from his father incredibly hostile. And we sat down and I said, so how do decisions get made on this farm? And it was him, and at the same level it was his father and his uncle and the agronomist and the farm manager. And I said, can you see why there's no consistency in decision making here, and can you see why there's so much tension? So it's just about thinking about something in a corporate way, no farming experience required particularly. Now, one of the things that Marie raised is his wife was incredibly prickly the whole day. And I said to her, Jo, is there anything you'd like to say? And she said, I am a really talented woman and I graduated with a degree from UWA and I cannot use my expertise in the country. So I totally back Marie there. There are very capable women who you could tap into. And it was a great experience for me mentoring a farmer, who would have thought. And I did make a big mistake because we've got kelpies at home, and I said, do you have a kelpie? And he said, yes. And I said, can I meet the kelpie? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, because it's covered in sheep shit. So I did show myself up to be very lacking in the farm affairs, but nonetheless it was a very happy partnership, and Ash is now growing some very low GI grain which will have profound effects for the food chain, not only here but internationally. Right, last two.
Hi, Lucia Lombardo, Senior Legal Counsel from Shell Australia. I'm really pleased to see the emphasis on childcare as one of the major pillars, but I also ask you to consider that children are in childcare age for a short period of time, and consideration needs to be given to children that are older, and also families that have extended families who are elderly and unwell, and women who have responsibilities or broader family members in that area. Just that comment, thank you.
And certainly it is picked up in the report, and it was mentioned by several of the women, saying that some of them were caught in an invidious position where they were caring for children and caring for elderly relations, so that's a very difficult. And I think that the point about childcare is well made, and that's why the recommendation is broader than that. It's about before school care, after school care, and particularly vacation care. And people said when they didn't have the extended family, if their child got sick, their whole world fell apart. So, you know, there's all sorts of complicating factors. Okay, last question. It'd be great if it was a bloke.
It is.
Oh, excellent.
Hi, Dave Atkin from Shell. I've recently moved to Perth from Eastern States. So I've got two young girls, and I really connect with the sentiments that when moving across here, some of the culture is different in terms of what we're expecting females in working at home, and the culture about what's happening, expectations for our kids. The interesting comment you made that you included the graduate cohort towards the end, or wasn't originally part of your plan. Have you thought about having to go back further and go younger? Because I really see and challenge this every day in the school, and my wife is really, really strong on this, challenging the school, the primary school that we're at, about comments about access for the girls and what they're doing, and setting up the expectations of what they can do in the future. So this is a lot of stuff that we've focused on, what the companies can do, what women can do, where are we at on what we can do in the schools and younger kids, primary schools, to get them thinking they can do this in the future.
I'm glad you asked that question, because last week I had funding approved for my next project, which is exactly that. I'm looking at late primary and early high school years in terms of a whole raft of things, but what's influencing their decisions with subject choices. Self-confidence in particular, we know, comes from that particular timing. So I'm going to be looking at a whole range of things that came out from our adult cohort, and then looking at the origins of that in children over the next 3 years. So thank you.
And you certainly will see a comment in our report that's anonymous that reflects on the peer group discussions that girls are having about subjects at school, which was pretty enlightening, I have to say. So we're going to draw it to a close. We're going to ask the steering committee to come to the stage so that we can take a photograph of this momentous occasion. And I want to thank my staff. So Georgie, who is our research officer and has just joined us on a full-time basis, has had the project coordination for the last year. Prior to that, we had Conrad, who asked a question before. He was the first one to beg and plead you to come to interviews, and then Holly took over. And she's also pulled together today with the rest of our staff. Gemma Davis, who's our Manager of Research and Strategy, wrote the original scope of work and continued to refine it very patiently with me to the point that we were able to engage Terry, so I really thank her. Our fact-based team at UWA also did some research, and that was really important. We felt that we couldn't put a report out that was just about anecdotes and people's perspectives. So fact-based stepped in and did what they do best, and that's to bring the evidence to bear. So each of you will get a copy of the report on the way out. I hope you share it widely and broadly. I hope that you take the actions and recommendations to heart. This is the group that's the most enlightened about this project, so it's up to you to be the ambassadors for it. I'm incredibly gratified by the people who have congratulated the Committee for Perth on this report. It's been a journey, I can tell you, but I can't think of another piece of work that's been done in the last few years on this topic that really gets to the heart of the issue for Perth by Perth. So it's up to all of you. Thank you very much. All right, steering group members, can I please have you up on the stage? And all the rest of you, one of you can eat my leftover dessert. Now, do you want to go that way? So Terry, I'll give you an official copy of the report. So, Shocky, take a copy of the report. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you. Georgie. You have to hold one.